Hey everyone, my name is Josh Williams. I'm the lead pastor here at Home City Vineyard. We're going to continue our series this week. It's the series Singing the Lord's Song in a Foreign Land. It's a story of Daniel. Thank you for making it through the snow, through any obstacle that you've had. I'm very thankful that you came. When it's not snowing now, but still, it can be an obstacle to get here. I'm also very thankful for the Mackies to be here. And I'm really sad this is your last Sunday, but thank you so much for being with us. And if you have not met the Mackies yet, it is worth it to stop by. Just raise your hand again. Stop by and say, hey, I hear you're the Mackies. Can I pray for you? Can I hear like one word of wisdom about ministry from you? Because you will be rocked. I really believe that. So again, this is the series we've been in. It's the third week, singing the Lord's Song in a foreign land. And at its heart, this series has posed the question of how people who follow God in an increasingly secular society to engage with wider culture. How do we do that as people who are interested in following God and do follow God with the culture that's in front of us? In the first chapter, we saw Daniel and his friends suggest godly alternatives to the powers that be when asked to eat and drink against their God-informed dietary restrictions. In the second chapter, we saw Daniel boldly decode the puzzles of the culture of the king through God's power. We've seen two models that have been pretty creative and peaceable, ways of engaging the wider culture.
But what happens when one must simply resist and say no directly to the prevailing culture? What happens then? That's where we find ourselves in the third chapter of Daniel. Strangely enough, even though this is the story of Daniel, Daniel is absent completely from this whole chapter. You'll see more later. But instead, the King Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel's three friends take center stage in this story. And here's how it begins. King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justice, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. When they were standing before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall be immediately thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up." Does anyone remember how last week ended? It was this same king, impressed by Daniel and the way that he decoded the puzzles of God, worshiping face down. The same king worshiping Daniel's God as God of gods. Possibly connected to the fact that Daniel's not in this part of the story, the king decides once again to go his own way, to worship many gods, and he's commanding others to do the same. This is a little strange. What would drive the king to do this? This is a king who's not just satisfied with the power of ruling a kingdom. Has he really become assured, kind of like convinced of yet another god, this time one robed in gold? Or is the king more interested in power, in forced submission, in psychological brutality? This king wants control. He wants control. And he's gathered all of his officials, you heard them all together multiple times. He wants all of them to come before him. And when they hear the sounds of horn, of pipe, of lyre, of trigon, of harp and drum, his entire musical ensemble, when they hear those things, to fall down and to worship wherever they are, this golden statue that the king set up. This is a king who's not just solely interested in one people, in one nation, in one language. This king wants to control multiple peoples, multiple nations, multiple languages, and force them all of them in their diversity, to worship the same golden statue in the same way, all at King Nebuchadnezzar's direction and timing. He wants to demonstrate his control over all, his control over everyone. Control over your attention and focus as you learn to recognize the sound that demands your obedience. Control of your body as you fall down in a sign of submission and weakness. Control of your adoration and passion as you worship this mute gold statue. This is more than a one-time contract to worship another god. This is more than luring someone into a bad decision against their convictions. It's even more than a singular punishment, like death. This king is calling for fidelity, a lifelong devotion that controls mind, body, and spirit. It is a totalizing call to submit to the control of the king through worshiping this large golden statue. Now, whenever we talk about large golden statues and worshiping them in public, we can start to check out a little bit from the conversation. This isn't our lives. We haven't done that during our snow day. This isn't the decision we have before us. It's kind of our pressing issues. Majestic sounds calling us to fall to our knees to worship a golden statue. They're not that relevant and applicable to us, right, in 2016? But aren't there sights and sounds today that dictate our behavior? Situations that call for our obedience, that call us to worship? Is it the usual sirens of our distorted humanity? The call of greed to slowly amass more money, more fame, power, and options. The call of security to stock up on backup plans, to avoid risk, to settle for comfort. The call of lust, seeking our attention from men and women who promise us intimacy from the privacy of our very own screen, through cheap emotional and sexual thrills. These calls have our number, and they dial us in through simple cues. The lure of power over people and situations, the fear of scarcity, the search for pleasure. They knock on the door of our weaknesses, and if we let them in, they control us. There are other more subtle forms of sounds that call for our worship too. Perhaps these situations are as simple as being constantly, repeatedly, always interrupted by the sounds notifying us of a text message or a notification on Facebook. Actions that draw us towards giving screens and pieces of metal our voluntary attention and adoration. Perhaps the call to worship comes from our family members or family cultures that we belong to. Ones that resound maybe loudly with the call of academic achievement or financial stability. Could it be the cue of a strategically placed insult from a parent? Maybe it's the praise a sibling receives. Could this be our call to worship? It could even be in the subtle lies that one culture or one ethnicity is right, best, most sophisticated. We can even fall into this trap through an allegiance to symbols and signs of faith rather than the God who those symbols and signs actually represent. These are sights and sounds that control us, that lead us towards wholehearted devotion of something other than God. When we're honest with ourselves, we know that even the way someone speaks to us, the disappointment in their tone, the slowness for them to compliment us, the disinterest in who we are. Even those things can make us shapeshift in an effort to grasp at our attention. We are people threatened to be controlled, directed, submitted to gods who are as mute as that gold image of the king that he forced people to worship. So is worshiping a golden statue relevant? Well, it depends on how you see your idol. What controls you? What are you tempted to worship that controls you? Your mind, your body, your spirit. I believe this was King Nebuchadnezzar's hope in forming his intricate musical call to worship. He wanted to form a people who responded to his control, his authority, his power. He wanted to use this control to force submission. And even if people worshipped a golden statue, we don't know if it was a golden statue of him or not, but even if it wasn't him, it was at his request. The king's power is really where everyone's attention, where their affection rest. When they hear those sounds, they have to worship. This is disturbing, yet I think it's present in our culture at every turn. We notice these moments most in times of transition, when we're kind of adjusting to something new. And sometimes they don't have the face of a king attached to them, but it's just an overwhelming presence in the culture around us. I saw this very clearly moving from Iowa, the great state of Iowa, to New England for school. They're a little bit different if you haven't heard those two places. To say the pace of speed of life was fast was a severe understatement coming where I'm from. The way people walked, the way they drove, the way they talked, it was fast, fast, fast. And it was all around. And I didn't know why people move fast at first. And then I realized it was to get ahead. It was to get more accomplished, to have more things crossed off of their to-do list. Busyness was the god that was lifted up and exalted. And as a relatively slow-paced Iowan, I just simply couldn't compete until I realized it was a competition. Then I was a little bit more game. I started to respond to the sounds of my local environment, calls to work harder, be more productive. Calls home became less frequent. Sleep became more scarce. Church became an option rather than a commitment. I lived as a controlled one. This was the state of Babylon, the formation of a controlled people. But it gets worse. King Nebuchadnezzar uses his power to cement the consequences for anyone failing to worship in the way that he orders. The consequence is death, the ultimate form of control, the ultimate form of forced submission. While most of us haven't experienced a threat of a consequence as dire as that one, we do often fear something being terminated if we don't worship according to the powers that be. Maybe it's the termination of our job. Maybe it's the loss of our reputation, of opportunities that we seek to have. We remain afraid of a tragic end, and as a result, we obey something or someone other than God. In my transition from Iowa to New Haven, my fear was losing an opportunity to fit in, losing a chance to get ahead. If I didn't change, my fear was that I would be left behind. There was something I was threatened by. This fear of loss, in this case the fear of death, is a power play by King Nebuchadnezzar, and it worked for his society until he got notice that some weren't playing this game. Some weren't following the rules the way that he thought they should be followed. Accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble shall fall down and worship the golden statue." And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up. You've got to wonder why these Chaldeans were so invested in bringing this claim before the king. Maybe, given that many of the Chaldeans were the enchanters and magicians from the last chapter, maybe they were jealous that Daniel interpreted the dream and not them. Perhaps they were annoyed that Daniel and these friends had seats of power and they didn't, and they were again envious. We can't know for sure, but it's interesting that the king isn't out on the streets enforcing his rule. The king isn't there. The king's just set up a system, and he knows that the people who he's controlling, they'll become the personal police force, his eyes and ears on who's following the rules and who's not. The Chaldeans' behavior reveals an ugly truth about us and what it means to be controlled. When controlled, we become the biggest enforcers of the rules that oppress us. Think about how perfect that is. The controlled ones enforce the control on others. The system perpetuates itself even as the king sits on his throne, resting, waiting. Will anyone break the rules today? I guess I'll find out. I'm not out there. Other people are, enforcing the rules for him. Given the way this king is obsessed with control and his own power, how will the king respond to this transgression of Shadrach, of Meshach, and Abednego? Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they brought those men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, and do not worship the golden statue that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the," if everyone wants to join, you can, "horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, an entire musical ensemble, to fall down and worship the statue that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" We see again the threat of this king. This man obsessed with his own control, his own power. I don't think he's defending his gods as much as he's defending his rules, his regulations. He even taunts the Jewish trio saying, "Who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" The trio's response is absolutely 100% stunning. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. If the God who we serve is able to deliver us, then let him do it. If not, just know this: we will not serve your gods, nor will we worship your statue. We submit to the authority of our God, not the control of you, even if it means death." These three men would rather submit to their God than respond to the control of the king. This is faith. This is trust. This is submission to God. And it's not just submission to the good things that God does for you. This is voluntary submission that comes from freedom, a kind of freedom that King Nebuchadnezzar does not offer his people. What does it mean to openly submit to God when there are very, very different options on the table? God making you victorious in this life, or God making you victorious in your death? Both options are still on the table. Given how stark these options are and how different they are to me, I wonder a few things. I have to ask myself a few questions. Am I open to failing as a result of godly obedience? Am I willing to enter the fires where God will need to rescue me? Or will I stay safe, worshiping other gods? Does my faith even leave room for things I see as negative, loss, sacrifice, even death, if God calls me to them? Simply put, can I embrace a faith like the fiery furnace, a sacrifice like the fiery furnace? Can I embrace a sacrifice like the cross of Christ? If I'm completely honest, I much prefer the two other alternatives we found in Daniel, if you remember them. Persuading others, or creative godly alternatives that we saw in chapter 1. Boldly solving the empire's problems in chapter 2. In those models, I still have my voice, my power of persuasion. I'm still working with some power, with some amount of effort that I can believe changes things. Effort that comes from me and what I choose to do with it. I'm still allowed control, or at least the facade of it. The furnace takes control away. It strips us of our agency. It silences our speech. All that's left is the raw obedience to face the heat. In the furnace, we finally have to submit to the God who makes meaning out of all-consuming fire, or to whatever mute idol will serve to protect us from temporary pain. It's a type of obedience that terrifies me, yet it's obedience that I'm called to, that you're called to. One that looks like submission to the true King with blazing fire all around. It is having to speak about the genuine convictions of your faith, even though your job is on the line. It is saying no to intimacy separate from God that is brokered by posturing or manipulation. It is the call to ask for forgiveness because God asked you to, not because you think the person will forgive you. In fact, you're quite confident they won't. It is standing up for what's right without risk, image, or self-protection causing you to back down. It is saying to the powers that be, if my King is able to rescue me, then let him deliver me. And if not, then know this, I will not serve, and I did not serve your gods. This is faith strong enough to be tested by fire. Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than was customary, and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound, into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire?" They answered the king, "True, O king." He replied, "But I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the fourth has the appearance of a god. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their tunics were not harmed, and not even the smell of fire came from them. This is God. Do you trust God? Whether you're just learning about this God or if you've been following this God for years, do you trust God? Do you trust that there is someone who walks with you, who talks with you, who rescues you from your troubles? Do you believe in a fourth man in the fire that has the power to save? Ultimately, in the story, everyone is found out in the fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar is found out once again as one not in control. The Chaldeans were found out as servants to a power that controlled them, that still was insufficient. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are found out as faithful ones who withstood the fires of testing and who were rescued by the true and living God. God, he was found out as one who cannot be controlled, one who cannot be tamed, a God who does not desire control, but voluntary submission, a God who rescues and is present to those in the fire. When the fire comes to you, how will you be found? When the fire comes to you, what's going to happen? Are you living under the control of a mute golden idol? Or are you submitted to the true King? Even gold burns at the right temperature, but our God created fire. We have a choice today to examine the sounds that call us to worship. What are they calling us to? Is it ourselves? Our own safety? Money? Pleasure? Fame? Or power? Is it family? Is it culture? Even symbols of religion? We need today to examine what we worship. What makes us bow down and fall to our knees? Would it save us from a fiery furnace? Would it rescue us from the gruesome cross of Christ? Does it respect our freedom? Or does it simply control us and desire more and more and more until we don't resemble anything that's free? Until we can't even choose to submit anymore. We just do. God's different than a mute golden statue. And in this story, he gives Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego the power to choose, the freedom to choose, the freedom to submit. If you notice in the story, he doesn't make them wear a cross. He doesn't force them to sing any worship song that you know. It doesn't even seem that he tells them to resist worshiping the golden statue. He simply gives them the freedom to decide to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. And they respond with rich, beautiful obedience. God, if you're able to deliver us, then deliver us. But if not, then be it known to you, lesser king, we'll not serve your false gods. So today, what will we do with our freedom? Will we be controlled by the powers that be? Will we submit to a power that granted us freedom in the first place? Which one will it be? We will submit to a power who desires to rescue, to save, and as it turns out, is more than able to do it. I I think when we decide to submit, a quiet trust grows in us. It enables us to resist being controlled, not because of our own power, but through the power of the God that we're submitted to. That frees us to stand up with God against the powers that would seek to threaten us. We see in these three that there are people that were able to say no. So where's our defiant no? Is there a place in your life where God's calling you to say no to the prevailing culture around you? Not to be controlled by these lesser gods, not to live in submission to anything else but God, who we can actually have us help with us in the threat of fire. What's your no? Maybe it's in an area of your background, of your culture, where you need to challenge an assumption that you've had for a while. Maybe it's part of your lifestyle, and it deals with how you treat money, how you treat romance, how you treat fame. Or could it be in a place where you really do feel silenced and brought low because of your faith, how you're representing who you believe in? Ask God to give you courage, to help free you from the control of this world and deliver you into the freeing submission of God. As Matt said earlier, this week we celebrated MLK at our church and beyond. This was a person who carried a defiant no inside of him. He saw the way the culture at large was telling him to worship whiteness only, segregation only, to favor the ways of the rich and powerful only. His faith in Jesus taught him to counter that culture. And MLK's calling started with a no. A no to eating at segregated lunch counters. A no to sitting at the back of the bus. A no to separate but unequal schools. A no to the apathy in the church. And a co-opting of the name of God. A no to systemic poverty and unjust wars. His no was so loud, he got thrown into the furnace a number of times. And while the fire singed him, he went right back to saying the no that God had given him. This was a man who resisted being controlled and who attempted to live life submitted to God. Finally, the furnace grew too hot. A bullet found his body, and death took MLK. Now, death took MLK, but it could never control what he had started to build, because it was under submission of the one true King. This true King offers freedom that this world cannot. God offers freedom that lasts past this life and stretches into the next. We see this most clearly several millennia after Shadrach, after Meshach, after Abednego. Jesus, perhaps that fourth man in the fire from our story today, models a life of voluntary submission, who in turn invites others to freely submit to God. Jesus abandons terrorizing tactics of control. He just doesn't use them during his earthly ministry. And as God's Son on earth, he models what authority looks like when submitted to good authority in God, a mature freedom. Jesus, facing the threat of fire in the form of a cross, says his own version of, if you can deliver me, then deliver me. But if you can't, let it be known on this tree that I didn't serve other gods. Then Jesus was killed. The King who offered freedom to others died in submission to his Father. Sacrifice, trust, obedience. This is what worship looks like. Compare Jesus' sacrificial actions to the actions of King Nebuchadnezzar after the Jewish trio were found completely spotless after the fire. If you want to follow along, this is at the very end of the 3rd chapter of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command," that's himself that he's talking about, "and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn from limb to limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. This king, right? Julian's going to talk more about this king later on, next week. Once again, he's so impressed with God, but Nebuchadnezzar still wants to use his own force, his own power, his own tactics to make his threatening presence known. Where control and violent force did not save Nebuchadnezzar at the beginning of the story, he tries another go-round, this time just threatening violence on behalf of God, who apparently he's now again buddy-buddy with. I don't understand that. And he's offering promotions again. I hope that we can see that this is empty worship. It contains signatures of faith, but it rings hollow. We don't want our faith to look like this. We don't want the cross on our neck to look like that. We don't want any symbol that we wear that would represent who Jesus is to look like that threatening violence. Tearing someone from limb to limb, houses laid to ruin. That's not who God is. That's not who Jesus is. This man who didn't even use the tactics of control in his ministry, but laid them down and simply invited people to come to know him. Jesus lets violence enter his body through his death on the cross. He doesn't use it. He lets it enter his body. And God's power raises him back to life. When faced with the people who killed him, as a resurrected God, what does Jesus do? He doesn't give into violence. He doesn't give into revenge. But instead, once again, for the umpteenth time, Jesus invites us to freely submit to his Father, to experience freedom and true life through him. Sacrifice, trust. This is worship unto the living God. This is what we celebrate in communion, which we'll take in a second. But before we reach communion, I want to invite the worship team up. I want to share 3 quick questions for us today. In what area of your life do you feel controlled? Is there some kind of power? Is there some kind of weight? A place where you're pulled and you know that it's not something that you want, but it's something that keeps happening. What place is it in your life where you feel control? Maybe it's fear. How can you grow trust between you and God? I think one thing we see in Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego is this incredible trust that can seem impossible to have. But I think that trust grew from a relationship. And I actually just want you to try something today, to think about worship, even musical worship that we're going to enter into, as a time where you voluntarily surrender, where you free yourself. Maybe that will be being quiet and still for you. Maybe it will be raising your hands. Maybe it will be actually bowing down low, putting your face on the ground and saying, I don't know actually how to lose power. I don't know how to desire other things, but I do know that I can physically change the shape of my body to reflect what I want my relationship with you, God, to be. I know that I can bow down with my actual body and hope that that will change my crippling pride. If that's something that you want to experiment with today, I challenge you to do that, to use the space in this room, to let your body actually be a prayer for what you want your heart and spirit to be. And the last one, what's the defiant no of your life, where you need to take bold action to resist the lure of other gods? As the Mackeys were talking about this church and saying what it's been, I have to agree with them. I've experienced the same thing coming to this church. And I think there's something special God's doing as he's developing our defiant no's. The ways we're not going to take up arms against the culture, but actually submit to God and still say, no, I can't worship that way. I won't worship that way. What's that thing for you? Where's God challenging you? Where is he inviting you? I believe this is going to be a church full of people who lovingly, creatively, powerfully, and humbly say no and invite people into a different way, this Jesus way. And it's the Jesus way, the way of lowering ourselves, humbling ourselves, but still being raised with power, that we celebrate in communion. We celebrate a broken body in Jesus on the cross, broken for us. That's the bread, and we take it and break it off and dip it into the cup that represents blood shed for us. And in that, we remember once again that Jesus is the kind of God that would take in violence on our behalf for our sake, rather than commit violence against us. So today in communion, remember that and worship, surrender, let go of control, and submit to the living God. Let me pray for us. Holy Spirit, would you come here? Would you be made manifest and known in this place? Would you give us the courage and the bravery to voluntarily submit to you if that's how you're leading us, God? So let us come before your table in awe and wonder of who you are and what you've done and what you will do. And let us take you in so we can be like you and represent you to the world around us. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.